This situation has grown far beyond a messy press tour. What we're looking at now isn't just awkward interviews or online backlash, it's depositions, financial fallout, rewritten scripts, and a very uncomfortable question about who was actually pulling the strings behind the scenes. Because once legal testimony enters the picture, this stops being gossip and starts becoming documentation. Let's begin where the consequences are measurable, the business impact. Blake Lively isn't only an actress attached to a controversial film, she's also tied to a beverage brand that heavily relies on her public image. She and Ryan Reynolds reportedly hold a significant ownership stake through their companies, and while they didn't invent the product itself, her likeness, influence, and visibility are central to its marketing strategy. She isn't just endorsing it, she is positioned as the face of it. And during sworn testimony in 2024, the CEO of that company admitted something important. In August of that year, the brand made the decision to pause social media activity due to what was described as amplified negativity flooding their platforms. Not typical criticism, not routine backlash, something far louder and more aggressive than anything they had experienced in the previous 3 years. That's not a small decision. Brands don't go dark casually. They especially don't pause major marketing initiatives featuring their most valuable asset unless the data is telling them continuing would make things worse. According to testimony, they were unable to proceed with large-scale promotional campaigns led by Blake because the online sentiment surrounding her had become intensely negative. That's a business disruption. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Blake has argued that external parties involved in the film damaged her reputation through an alleged smear effort, and that this reputational harm directly impacted her other ventures, including this brand. But the timeline reveals something more layered. Even before the film controversy escalated, she had already faced public criticism for promoting an alcohol-adjacent product while openly stating she doesn't drink herself. That contradiction triggered debate long before the movie's press tour unraveled. Then came the promotional campaign for a film centered on domestic abuse, a campaign many viewers felt was tone-deaf. The backlash snowballed, and when that backlash spilled into her business ventures, the company stepped back from visibility. The key issue isn't whether negativity existed, it clearly did. The issue is origin. If public reaction stemmed from marketing choices made during the film's rollout, that shifts the liability conversation dramatically, because admitting personal missteps during promotion could weaken a claim that the fallout was entirely caused by someone else. And once legal strategy enters the picture, every public statement becomes calculated. There's another angle here that makes the situation even more complex: her role on the film itself. Blake has framed herself in some contexts as an employee during production, but evidence suggests she had significant creative involvement, including script rewrites, wardrobe input, and even production credit. That begins to look less like a traditional acting role and more like a contractor with influence, and contractors assume risk differently than employees do. If you're deeply involved in shaping the project, you can't easily separate yourself from its outcomes. Which brings us to the script revisions. Emails circulated during production show Blake sending rewritten scenes directly to executives and the director. Actors offering notes isn't unusual, but what raised eyebrows were certain additions that felt tonally inconsistent with the original source material. One phrase in particular stood out, a crude slang term that many readers had to look up because it wasn't commonly used. It carried a sexually explicit meaning that didn't align with the emotional tone of the novel the film was based on. The question wasn't just why it was included, the question was who included it. online observers noticed the same unusual slang had appeared elsewhere in pop culture projects closely associated with Ryan Reynolds' comedic style. Coincidence? Possibly, but it fueled speculation that he may have had more involvement in the rewrites than publicly acknowledged. And that speculation deepened when additional dialogue included dark humor about a deceased parent, humor that seemed oddly inconsistent with later complaints that similar topics felt inappropriate during filming. That contradiction matters, because deposition excerpts show Blake acknowledging that she may have used the word sexy multiple times in creative discussions about wardrobe or character presentation. She admitted it could have come up more than once in a film context, yet previous claims described discomfort when similar language was allegedly directed toward her. The legal battlefield here isn't about whether certain words are inherently inappropriate. It's about consistency. If the vocabulary was common in creative conversations, then proving it constituted harassment in a single instance becomes far more complicated, and juries notice inconsistency. Another point raised during testimony involved wardrobe approval. At one moment, she suggested uncertainty about who ultimately signed off on costume decisions. But in other public statements, she had described extensive involvement in styling choices, even boasting about sourcing outfits and shaping the aesthetic herself. Those two positions don't sit comfortably together. And that's the pattern emerging across this entire situation. Overlapping narratives that don't always align cleanly when placed side by side. The backlash was real, the brand impact was real, the rewrites were real, the deposition statements are real. What remains unclear is where responsibility ultimately lands. Because once reputational damage intersects with business losses, creative control, and personal credibility, the story stops being about who said what in an interview. It becomes about who can prove consistency under oath, and that changes everything. As the financial implications were unfolding behind closed doors, another layer of this controversy was quietly gaining traction, and this one cuts straight into the creative core of the film itself. Because when actors send suggested edits, that's collaboration. But when rewrites start shifting tone, inserting specific slang, and reframing character dynamics, people start asking whether this was still collaboration or something more strategic. During production, revised pages were circulated that adjusted dialogue in key emotional scenes. One of those moments involved a conversation about domestic violence, a deeply sensitive topic central to the story. In the rewritten version, certain lines appeared that felt tonally off compared to the original novel. Not necessarily dramatic changes to plot, but subtle shifts in language that altered emotional weight. One phrase in particular caught attention because it wasn't just unusual, it was oddly specific. It referenced crude slang that many readers didn't recognize and had to research. The meaning attached to it online was explicit and sexual in a way that didn't align naturally with the scene's gravity. That alone raised eyebrows. But what escalated the speculation was the stylistic fingerprint. The humor felt sharp, slightly dark, a little irreverent, a tone that closely resembles Ryan Reynolds' well-known comedic brand. The kind of humor that plays well in self-aware action comedies, but feels misplaced in a story centered on trauma and emotional healing. Now, to be clear, there's no public document definitively stating he wrote those lines, but what fueled the conversation was pattern recognition, the rhythm, the phrasing, the familiar edge. And then there were other additions. In one exchange, a male character jokes about killing a deceased abusive father, and the female character responds in a way that suggests she finds the dark humor attractive. That detail feels intentional. It reframes the character dynamic in a way that leans into edginess rather than vulnerability. Here's where the contradiction becomes difficult to ignore. Later claims suggested that certain comments made during filming felt inappropriate or uncomfortable, yet these rewrites appeared to embrace humor about sensitive subjects. If those lines remained in any draft during production, it complicates the narrative that the creative environment was entirely one-sided in tone. Again, the issue isn't about whether dark humor can exist in serious films. It's about consistency between public claims and documented script revisions. And the speculation didn't stop at dialogue. Observers began questioning whether the communication style in certain behind-the-scenes messages also reflected outside influence. Some wondered if Blake's assertive tone in production emails matched her usual professional voice, or if someone else known for punchy writing had a hand in shaping them. That might sound minor, but in legal disputes, authorship matters. If creative control was exercised by someone unofficially, it shifts responsibility. Meanwhile, tension reportedly built around creative direction. Blake has previously stated that she felt the story needed to be told from a distinctly female perspective, but critics argue that some of the rewritten humor undercuts that claim. If the goal was sensitivity and authenticity, why insert slang and edgy jokes that distract from emotional realism? That question lingers. And then there's the broader context. Ryan Reynolds is not just a supportive spouse. He is a highly successful producer and marketer with a reputation for strategic brand management. His involvement in projects often goes beyond surface-level participation. He understands narrative control, both in films and in public perception. So, when his stylistic trademarks seem to echo in a script connected to a separate production, people notice. The deeper concern here isn't about one slang term or one joke, it's about influence. If an outside party contributed significantly to script revisions without formal credit, that raises questions about transparency in the creative process. And if those revisions altered tone in ways that later conflicted with public complaints, that tension becomes legally and reputationally significant, because creative fingerprints can tell a story of their own. And as more documentation surfaces, what we're seeing is a pattern of overlapping roles: actor, producer, brand ambassador, investor, creative contributor. Lines blur, responsibilities overlap, accountability becomes harder to isolate. At the center of all of this is a film that was supposed to spotlight the complexity of abusive relationships and emotional resilience. Instead, it became a case study in what happens when marketing strategy, personal branding, and creative control collide. And the public isn't just watching the headlines anymore, they're reading the paperwork. If the business fallout exposed financial vulnerability and the script rewrites exposed creative tension, the deposition excerpts may be the most revealing layer of all, because they force everything into direct, recorded answers. When questioned under oath about language used on set, Blake acknowledged that she likely used the word sexy in creative discussions more than once. She framed it as part of the artistic context, describing wardrobe, character presentation, or tone. She couldn't recall exact moments, but she didn't deny that the term was part of her vocabulary during filming. That matters, because earlier claims suggested discomfort when similar language was directed toward her. The central issue isn't whether anyone is allowed to use a specific word. It's about consistency in reaction. If the same terminology is acceptable in one direction, but framed as inappropriate in another, opposing counsel will inevitably highlight that contrast. Depositions are not about emotions, they're about patterns. Another area that raised questions involved wardrobe control. In some public conversations, Blake described having significant input over styling, even emphasizing that she sourced certain outfits and influenced the aesthetic direction. Yet during questioning, she expressed uncertainty about who ultimately approved wardrobe decisions. She suggested that fittings were photographed and sent to decision-makers, but did not clearly identify who had final authority. Those two narratives feel difficult to reconcile. If you publicly celebrate creative control, it becomes harder to later distance yourself from the same domain when disputes arise. That's not a moral judgment, it's a legal dynamic. The more authority you appear to have exercised, the more ownership you may be perceived as holding over the outcome. And then there's the broader financial dimension. The beverage brand's decision to pause marketing campaigns featuring Blake wasn't framed as a casual adjustment. It was described as a response to overwhelming negativity. If that negativity stemmed from public reaction to promotional choices during the film's rollout, then establishing a direct line of causation to outside interference becomes more complex. In lawsuits involving reputational damage, proving intent and origin is everything. It's not enough to show that backlash happened. You must demonstrate that it was orchestrated or unjustly amplified by the opposing party. Otherwise, it becomes public sentiment, and public sentiment is notoriously difficult to assign to a single source. There's also the contractor versus employee question lingering beneath all of this. If Blake functioned with production-level influence, contributing to rewrites, shaping tone, holding creative credit, then her role may be interpreted as collaborative rather than subordinate. That distinction affects how damages are evaluated. Contractors assume different levels of risk and responsibility than employees do, which brings this entire situation into sharper focus. This isn't just a celebrity dispute about on-set discomfort. It's a collision between personal branding, business investments, creative authority, and legal positioning. Every statement now lives in two worlds, the court of public opinion and the actual courtroom. And juries are instructed to look for coherence. If script revisions introduced edgy humor while later testimony emphasized sensitivity, if wardrobe influence was celebrated publicly but minimized under oath, if brand losses are attributed entirely to external sabotage while depositions acknowledge widespread public backlash, those inconsistencies don't disappear, they become cross-examination material. What started as a film adaptation has evolved into something much larger, a test of credibility, documentation, and narrative control. And unlike promotional interviews, depositions don't allow for carefully curated messaging. They capture hesitation, uncertainty, and nuance. At this stage, the outcome won't be decided by social media threads or viral clips. It will hinge on whether the competing stories align cleanly with the evidence. Because in high-profile disputes like this, reputation isn't just shaped by headlines, it's shaped by what holds up when every word is examined.